America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neo-Fusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of Neo-Fusionism. Neo-Fusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. This episode, we're going to be reading Being and Time by Martin Heidegger. And I will let you know right off the bat, this is possibly, well, not possibly, definitely, the most challenging book that I have ever read. It took me a while to get through it, and there are parts of it, I'm not going to lie, there were a few parts of it when I just didn't get it. I read and reread a few sections, and there were some sections that I just said, I could reread this and I know I'm not going to get it. And I just trudged forward until I got to a point where I felt like I understood it. So I'm not going to lie, there were parts of it I struggled with. Why did I choose this book? Well, I think that Heidegger has some sort of appeal to me based on what I have heard and read about him and his ideas. And when I say that, I guess I should kind of throw in there that Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party. And so I have to say that I'm not intrigued with him because he was a Nazi. I'm intrigued with him because he was a philosopher who advocated for a sort of traditional lifestyle. He lived in the Black Forest, and he in fact was offered a high-ranking position in Berlin at one point that he turned down because he didn't want to live in the city. He wanted to stay in a more rural area because of the lifestyle that he lived, and his belief system kind of was something that kept him in more of a traditional lifestyle. He would wear to various, events and conferences and whatnot. He would wear very traditional, like German lederhose, like a peasant's. He would dress like a German peasant, because he wanted to have a strong connection with his people and his past, the past of his people, I should say, his heritage. That was important to him, and so I find that compelling. And he was very concerned about technology and what it was doing to the modern world. I guess he was a critic of the modern world as it existed in Germany in the 20s, in the 20s when he wrote this book. And through the 30s and 40s and 50s, etc. He was a critic of the modern world, and there was a movement in Germany in the 20s toward conservatism. I think it's commonly referred to as the Conservative Revolution. Produced authors like Spengler and Heidegger and a few others that I'm not going to go into detail about right now, but it was kind of a movement, and I think Heidegger was plugged into that. But it was different than what we see as conservatism in the U.S. now. It was very much a return to nature sort of thing, and it was in part, I think there was a rejection of modern liberalism as it stood at that time, but also a bit of a rejection of Christianity. There was a turn toward the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and I find all of that very compelling. And so, because of that, Heidegger has had an appeal to me. And so, Being in Time is kind of his magnum opus. It was his first book, and in it he lays out the core components of his philosophy that he's going to work with in one way or another for the rest of his life. And so I think that there are some of his later writings, his post-World War II writings and other things that maybe tie in a little more closely with what we've been talking about in this podcast. But in order to get to those, in order to open them up and explore them adequately, we have to have a foundation in being in time. So while I'm going to go over this book and it may not seem like this is really pertinent to neo-fusionism, in a way it is, because I'm going to go down some avenues with this podcast where I'm going to be exploring some of the ideas of existentialism and some of the ideas of paganism and some of the ideas of pre-Socratic Greece, some of the criticisms of Christianity, and it's going to come back to Heidegger periodically. There are a few of his books, The Question Concerning Technology, The Introduction to Metaphysics. I haven't read those yet, but I understand that the content of those books is going to be more closely aligned with the contents of this podcast. And so I've got a few books by Heidegger, I've got a few books about Heidegger, and I want to make a portion of this podcast into an exploration of Heideggerian existentialism and to kind of see how it relates to some of the ideas of neo-fusionism, because I believe that it does and I believe that it will. I guess I can already kind of get an idea that Heidegger and this kind of school of thought of which he's a part has a connection to the German notion of Heimat, which translates loosely to home. I don't think he uses the phrase in this book, but I do think that later on in his career, he uses the word Heimat and he addresses the concept of home, having a home, and being at home in the world. This is a concept that we're going to explore in this podcast, being at home in the world, feeling as if the world is your home, your culture is your home, your geographic location is your home, nature is your home, the present moment, etc. A sense of being where you belong. And that's kind of going to tie back to an Aristotelian perspective of things, people, concepts having a place where they belong. Now, this kind of contradicts some of modern physics, and I'm not interested in contradicting our understanding of physics, right? Or our understanding of reality, that, we live in a Cartesian space as opposed to like a geocentric spiritual space where like the world or the underworld is the center of the universe, and the world is the center of the universe, and we're surrounded by the spheres of the heavens, like an Aristotelian perspective on reality. That's obviously not true. But when we begin to explore human consciousness, there's a difference between feeling like you are where you belong and feeling like you are perpetually seeking something that you don't currently have, which is like to be a nomad in the world. There's a different state of mind associated with these perspectives, and we adopt them kind of unconsciously. And I talked about in my review of Revolt Against the Modern World how progressivism is sort of a endless seeking. Like, what are you like it's walking, like you're progressing from something to something. You're always changing, always moving forward, forward, upward, whatever it may be. Like you're perpetually progressing in a kind of a linear fashion toward something, but you're never really going toward anything other than a direction. Because once you get to a spot and you stop there and you stay there because you like it, then you're home and you're no longer progressing. So that conservatism, I believe, wants to maintain something. It wants to conserve something, some way of life or whatever. And there's a reason that there's a direction to, or an impetus to conserve or maintain or stay in one place. And that is a sense of belonging, a sense of being rooted in a place, rooted in a culture, rooted in a people, rooted in a way of life and a state of mind that broadcasts it depends upon a concept of being home. And I think that, to me, that's like rooted in a sense of love for what is, instead of like a utopian desire for what is not, in hopes of creating something that you will love, as opposed to loving what already is. So that inclination toward loving what is and being centered and being home is a core component of my perspective on how I'm trying to assemble this neo-fusionist idea. And especially like the idea of the center. This is something that I guess I should mention now. I was going to mention in my first episode, but I didn't. So now is as good a time as any, that I think that the idea of centrality is something that I'm realizing is kind of a core component of my belief system. And I want to make a distinction here. It's a fine pointed distinction, but I'll make it, between being centered and being central. Because to be centered is to be acted upon. It's a passive state. To be central is an active state, and it is a state of necessity. If something is central to your life, it's the most important thing. If you are central to something else, then you are in a central position. So you're in the center. You could say you are centered, but you're the active component rather than the passive component of being centered. And I think that that's important. There's a solidity to it, a permanence to it, that to me is along the same lines of being rooted, being grounded, being home. So Heidegger, I think, touches on this in a way in his work. And I kind of want to explore Heidegger to see if I can find that in his work and how he expresses it, if he expresses it, how he expresses it, and how we can maybe learn from that to adopt it and adapt it to neo-fusionism and to politics and to philosophy. So there you have it. Now, what is he talking about? Oh, one other thing before I go into this book. I'm not going to read from this book. I initially started a version of this podcast in which I was reading from the book, and I stopped, and I decided that it's not going to work, really, because this isn't the sort of book where you can jump in to a portion partway through and start reading and get it. Especially if you're listening and you can't go back easily and reread a sentence or read it at your own pace. If you have to listen to it at my pace, I don't think that that's really effective for this book, and I think it's gonna just people are just gonna gloss over when I start reading from it. So I'm not going to do that. This will be the first time I've done a podcast and not read from the book I'm reviewing. But instead, I'm going to kind of summarize it, a little bit of commentary. This podcast might not be as long as some of the others because I'm not reading from it. We'll see. We'll find out how it goes. But I'm really trying to lay the foundation for future podcasts with what I'm talking about here. So let's get into it. Now, the core concept of being in time is he proposes as the question of the meaning of being. And he basically says that in pre-Socratic Greece, the question of the meaning of being was in people's minds. And starting with Socrates, there's a deviation. I guess he actually puts it more on Plato, to be honest. But I think he might kind of put it on Socrates as well. There's a deviation away from the meaning of being and a contemplation of being and an awareness of the mystery of being and the amazing fact that we exist, and into a state of mind where the fact of existence is simply taken for granted as obvious and no longer explored or considered And he proposes that there is a loss to the quality of philosophy as a result of that. And I think that's interesting. I'm interested in the pre-Socratic Greeks. I'm interested in the Greeks in general, as you probably can tell from some of the things I talk about. So that's another reason that I wanted to go into this book and go into Heidegger, because of his focus on the meaning of being. And he says that the best way to explore the meaning of being would be to consider that entity for which being is an issue. And that entity is us. We, I, as a being, as an entity, can concern myself with the fact of my own existence. And for that reason, he says, well, in order to understand being, let's start by understanding people, understanding what it is to be a person. But really, he explores that on a fundamental ontological, which means pertaining to the study of existence, a fundamental primordial ontological basis. And so he calls people or a person dasein, and he doesn't mean that to be a person's body or even a person's personality. I don't believe. I think that the dasein is the fact of existence of a consciousness, of an entity which can say, I am. And so he tries to say, well, what is dasein? What is the nature of dasein? And he postulates that the nature of dasein is being in the world. That's the phrase that he uses that comes up through the whole book. He opens this up to say, well, what is being? What is in? What is the world? And so that's kind of like a fundamental premise here of this book. And I think it's interesting, and I'll take a moment to point out that when he talks about the world, being in the world, he's not just talking about like a infinite, a space, an open space that extends in infinite directions in 3 dimensions, which we refer to as Cartesian space. That's our common concept of space, our common concept of the universe and the world, right? Is this kind of God's eye view of reality. But Heidegger doesn't really want to take this God's eye view. Because what presupposes it from a phenomenological perspective, which is really, the perspective that he originates his theory from, our perceptions, the phenomena which we experience, is not that of this 3-dimensional space. Not exactly. I mean, it is, but it's a component of how we exist. We exist in the world, in a world of our own, right? The world to me is different than the world to someone else. I see things from a specific angle. I interact with things in a specific way, unique to me. That's my world. The world, my world begins with my birth and ends with my death. That world, as I perceive it, my world is not perpetual. Our public world of reality is perpetual, but the world that I experience, the world that I live in, is unique to me. And so that's an interesting aspect of how he talks about being in the world. And in that sense, I am central to my world. This is kind of a thing where I find that centrality notion. I live in a 360-degree environment. I'm in the center of it. I look around to my left, to my right, etc., and I see things all around me. I see people and I see an environment, and things, come at me, and I interact with them and I manipulate them. But I'm in the center of a phenomenological, experiential environment. And so that's kind of an interesting, different take on what the world is and how we perceive it. And that's natural to us. So objects within this world, entities within this world, take on, according to Heidegger, take on one of two ways of being, one of two forms. There are things which are present at hand, and that would be like my coffee mug on the table that's in front of me right now. It's present at hand in the sense that it is a material object of a certain particular color and shape, temperature. It has various qualities. It is substantial. If I touch it, I can feel it. It is a thing which is present in Cartesian space before me, in a particular location, right, that I can perceive. In that sense, it is present at hand. But my interaction with this coffee cup is not necessarily one where I experience it solely as this given material in this given shape, in this given spot with this given color. I experience it as a coffee cup, as a tool, or as equipment. And if I hold it in my hand and I'm talking into this microphone and perhaps I'm sipping my coffee periodically, I'm not thinking about the coffee cup, right? I'm just using it as a tool. It's not even in my mind really so much as it's in the background of my mind. It's what Heidegger would call ready to hand. And it's equipment. Equipment as equipment is ready to hand. Objects, things, are present at hand in that sense. Like, for example, the microphone that I'm talking into, I haven't thought about it until I mentioned it. And so now I see it in front of me and it becomes present at hand in the sense that it's a thing here, which is in my consciousness. The chair I'm sitting on, I didn't think about it until just now. I'm using it. It's ready to hand. It's a part of my world, but it's serving a equipmental function. And even the air that I breathe is ready to hand. I'm not experiencing it as a gas that surrounds me, you know? I'm experiencing it as, you know, that which I breathe. So he makes that distinction between present at hand and ready to hand when he's describing the world around us. And most scientific approach views things strictly as present at hand. And the manner in which something may be ready to hand wouldn't necessarily be studied by science, except in the sense that, well, how is the human mind, how does the human brain perceive things and categorize them? But Heidegger is more concerned with experiential reality. And so in that parameter, with those parameters, he defines things as present at hand and ready to hand. And then he moves on from there. This is kind of in his description of what the world is. He moves on from there to two different ways of being. And he doesn't, I don't think, you know, I'm not really going necessarily chronologically through the book, but from a conceptual point, I feel like it's important to make this distinction between authentic and inauthentic being. And I'll get to authentic being in a little bit. And in the book, he starts talking about inauthentic being first, because inauthentic being is kind of how we live our daily lives and is most familiar to us and is easiest for us to grasp, this inauthentic life, inauthentic being. And one of the ways that he differentiates these is, well, this is my interpretation of a differentiation that I don't think he exactly puts it in these words. I'm reading it this way. And, you know, if you're listening to this podcast and you're a Heidegger scholar and you say, no, that's not what he means. You know, you can comment on whatever site you're using to listen to this podcast, and I will, in all likelihood, find it. You can send me a Twitter message. My Twitter handle is in the show notes. Reach out to me, email, whatever. And let me know if you have comments, if you agree or disagree with how I'm interpreting this. This is the kind of thing that, scholars have been arguing over for almost the past century, as to different ways to interpret Heidegger and whatnot. But my interpretation is this. So he talks about care and he talks about concern. And I interpret that to say that care is like directionality, like you want something. You care about something. You have some value or some preference for something to be some certain way. And then he talks about concern also. And concern to me seems to be an occupation. So that if you are twiddling your thumbs, you might not, you are concerning yourself with the twiddling of the thumbs, but you might not really care which thumb twiddles and which thumb twaddles or what have you. Like, you might not care how fast you're twiddling your thumb. You're just doing it to keep yourself occupied, to occupy your brain with some activity to stave off boredom. That's concern. The things with which we concern ourselves are the methods by which we live inauthentic lives. And when we direct ourselves toward care, we begin living authentic lives. And that's kind of my interpretation of his use of the words care and concern. So let me talk a little bit about concern and inauthenticity. One of the concepts that he brings up is everydayness. Everyday this, everyday that. And this is not a bad thing. It's not like you should be, ashamed of living an everyday sort of life, or that you somehow are going to ever possibly escape it. It's part of being. It's part of our natural existence to engage with the world in an everyday manner. But there's an inauthenticity kind of baked into everydayness. Because in your everydayness, you are in the world with other people, and you kind of absorb this notion of the they. And it's kind of strange. The they is his way of framing this. And the they is the common idea, the common ideas, the common ways of approaching the world, what we value, what we don't value, how we speak, the facial expressions that we make. The they is, the faceless masses in some regard. It's the communal rules, the social norms. It's not attributable to any one person or specific group of people. It's the ideas that are carried by those people with whom you interact. And I should specify here that the they is not going to be the same in different places, in different times, for different people. There's always a they, but it's not the same they. Your cultural norms are going to vary depending on all these different factors of where you are and when you live. So you're going to interact with a different they, but it's always going to be the they. And there are a few ways in which the they affects us. One of them, he talks about idle talk. When we communicate with other people about what the they thinks, and we refine the notions of the they. You are the they. It's not just them other than you, all those people other than you who are the they. You're one of the they. Everyone is one of the they. It's the composite of everybody. So when you ask yourself, who am I? Who are you? You are, in some sense, you are the they. You advocate what the they advocates. You hold your coffee cup the way the they holds their coffee cup. And to someone else who is not you, they're getting their signals of what the they expects from you. And so there's a sense in which you are inauthentic insofar as you are a representation of the they. And so, your idle talk, you manifest the they. And another thing that you manifest is what he calls curiosity. Curiosity we normally consider as a positive trait or quality, but he talks about curiosity like it's the quest for fascination. To never get particularly deep into any concepts or thought processes, to just seek out kind of the shiny baubles of reality. As soon as you acquire a rudimentary understanding of something, you are inclined to move on to the next thing. That kind of seems like a social commentary that he's tying in here. Is everyone continually bound by curiosity? I mean, I think if you're a brain surgeon, you inevitably have more than simply a passing curiosity in brain surgery. You get right into it, but curiosity is a way in which we maintain inauthenticity. It's a way in which we live our everyday lives. It's what makes our everyday lives everyday. It's a quality of the everydayness of inauthenticity, is curiosity. So there's kind of a sort of rundown of inauthenticity, a brief rundown of inauthenticity. But in order to get into authenticity, we have to bring up something else, which is time. He talks about, the book is called Being and Time. And he talks more about time in the second half of the book, but, it runs through a lot of concepts that he brings up throughout the book. But I'll kind of give a brief breakdown here of his perception of time. So just like I talked about with space, you could have a three-dimensional infinite field with no particular point having any value or importance over any other particular point, which would be Cartesian space, fully neutral. And then there's being in the world, in which a one particular space, which is the space that you occupy, is of greater importance to you, right? Because as an individual, you experience yourself as the center of the world. Well, within time, he talks about like clock time, or kind of a standard present at hand vision of time, which is that it is a sequence, and this is my interpretation of what he's saying. There's a sequence of moments, an infinite series of moments that pass from one to the next seamlessly. And like, to make an example, this isn't an example of his, but it's my example, that if you were to have a clock, he talks about clocks, but hypothetically, if you were to have a clock and the clock was, I don't know, so large that it would keep ticking through all of eternity and it would never come back to the same point again. Which is, it's a hypothetical universal clock. No particular point on that clock would be any more special than it. And even on like an everyday average clock, no particular point on that clock has some sort of universal significance outside of its own numbering system, which makes a moment of more importance than another moment, right? I mean, it's just an endless sequence of equally neutral moments. But in our perception of time, there is a moment of distinction, which is the present moment, right? There's now, what's happening now. And I talked a little bit in my first episode about time, and how remarkable time is, in the sense that that everything that exists now. Now exists, and in a certain sense, the past doesn't exist, and the future doesn't exist. It exists as potentiality, and it exists as effects, the effects of the past and the potential of the future. And if you look at the world in a very deterministic perspective, the past is completely set in stone, could never have been any other way. The future is completely set in stone, could never have been in any other way. And even the present moment is therefore set in stone, but it's different. It's fundamentally different because it's experiential in that you are here now. And, it kind of makes you wonder, does the present moment depend on experience? Like if there was a universe in which there was no life, there was no perception, nothing to say now is now, nothing to be in the now and to experience it as such. It was just a long, drawn-out sequence of chemical reactions. No will. I mean, even if you were to believe in free will of living things, a universe with no living things wouldn't even have a space for free will to exist. It would just literally be just chemical reactions, which are completely prescribed ahead of time, unfolding. Would there even be such thing as a present moment in such a universe? I mean, I guess you could only ever look at it from the outside. You could never look at it from the inside because it's a world without life. So if you were to look at it from the outside, there is no now. There is no present moment in that universe. So anyway, just kind of something to think about. But his discussions of time are such that he wants to talk about the experiential version of time as opposed to the present at hand clock recording version of time, where in the temporality, as he calls it, there is a past, present, and future, not just an endless sequence of neutral points. There is the past, the present, and the future, which is how we as dasein experience time. So the being that is associated with the past, he kind of takes things and divides them up between these three things of past, present, and future. And so the being of the time, the sense of the aspect of being most closely associated, I guess, with the past, is a concept called thrownness. And what thrownness means is that we don't choose to be born. We don't choose to exist. Yet here we are. In that sense, we're thrown into the world. And we don't choose where we're born, how we're born, who we're born to, what we look like, anything that has to do with the specifics, or even the fact that we are humans, as opposed to, that you might be a dog or a cat or whatever. That you're thrown into reality. And here you are. And you're thrown into a certain circumstance. And there you are in that circumstance. Through no choice of your own, right? So you have particulars about you as a result of your thrownness and as a result of the nature of the world. And those particulars he calls your facticity. And this would be, your demographic qualities, your family, your socioeconomic status, just the exact scenario in which you're born. That's your facticity. So then the future is your projection. It is the manner in which you visualize a future and choose what future you want to live in. You see the possibilities of your potential being, the different ways in which you might exist hypothetically, and you select one. And you're continually selecting. You're continually choosing what world you live in. Even if you're not doing anything, you're choosing not to do anything. So you're projecting yourself onto the world. You're projecting yourself into the future in a particular specific manner. And there are limits to what you can and can't choose to do based on your facticity. Like if you're a man, you can't choose to have children. We'll skip the transgender concepts for now. If you're a biological male, let's say, you can't choose to give birth to a child. You can't, but there are, you can't choose whether or not you are going to bend your knee to the king, because there's no king, right? You don't live in an era where there are kings. You can't choose whether or not to kill your brother if you are an only child. You have certain things that are options available to you and certain options that are not available to you. And the entirety of options available to you, my understanding of this is that he calls the situation is essentially the entirety of options available to you that you might not even be aware of, but the various means you have at your disposal to be authentic, to achieve authenticity, is the situation. Now, let's bring it to the present moment. In the present moment, the mode of being that he most closely associates with the present moment is fallenness. The fact that we are fallen into the world in such a way that we are bound, I suppose, to have at least some component of inauthenticity. Our default scenario is one of inauthenticity. Our default scenario is to be one of the they. And that's what is fallen about us, is our obsession with concern for idle talk and curiosity and inauthentic things. So, but it's not inevitable that we be perpetually fallen. We can potentially aim ourselves toward something more authentic. How? And what does that mean? Well, we have a conscience that recognizes our fallenness, and our conscience calls us to authenticity. Essentially, our conscience says, you're guilty of being fallen, and you can be more than just inauthentic. You can be your authentic, true self. You have possibilities of charting your own path, I suppose would be the best way to put this. And so you have some quality called resoluteness, where you can be resolutely receptive to moving toward the direction that your conscience calls you to. And that's a resolute. And if you're resolute, then you're moving toward authenticity. And if you're irresolute, then you are lingering in inauthenticity. And he describes something called being toward death. Being toward death basically means that you are aware, and being toward death in an authentic manner would mean that you are aware of your mortality, perpetually aware of your mortality. Your mode of being is one which adapts to your mortality. That you know you're going to die. You don't know when it's going to happen, but it is a part of your existence. You are dying slowly from the moment that you're born. In a sense, you're perpetually moving closer and closer to your own death. Your potential avenues of being are limited. You don't have unlimited capacity to do different things, right? And so that he calls it anticipatory resoluteness, which is where you move toward your conscience with a continual awareness of your own mortality. That's my understanding of what he's saying. He talks about anxiety. He talks about moods, and he talks about anxiety. And anxiety is one in which it's a state of mind in which we are aware of our own mortality, and we are aware of our fallenness, and we are aware of our potentiality for being, and we're unnerved by these things because they counter it's a way of being that is contrary to the inauthenticity with which we've grown comfortable. And so he kind of presents anxiety as a positive, although perhaps traumatic, overall positive experience. I mean, I guess, he tries not to be normative and judgmental as far as what is the right and wrong way to be. But I think that, he lets slip in that, an authentic life is preferable to an inauthentic life, or at least striving toward authenticity is something that we should engage in. And so anxiety is kind of a doorway or an avenue toward a life of greater authenticity. And that is largely the thrust of the argument. He talks a bit more specifically about time as well. This was some of the stuff that started to go over my head. I'm interested in time, but I think I might need to go back and read it again, and I don't know as though it's as closely related to what I want to do with this podcast to get into the real specifics of time and how we experience it. But one thing that he talked about when he was talking about time that I want to bring up, he kind of went down a kind of a bit of a diversion where he talked about fate and destiny. And my understanding of fate, as he defines it, is that you have a specific potential course of action that you may or may not follow. But as you follow a course of action that is resolute and that is oriented toward authenticity, you get closer and closer to achieving your fate. If you live an irresolute life and an inauthentic life, in that way, you are deviating from your fate. Now, I believe that Heidegger says, I believe for myself, but I also believe that Heidegger believes that nobody's life is authentic or inauthentic. Everyone's life is some combination of the two. And so you can never truly achieve your fate, but you can strive toward it. And he also talks about destiny, and this is where he talks briefly. I wish he had talked more about this, but he talks about destiny in the sense of a community of people who collectively strive toward their fate. Then that community achieves its destiny. And I was really interested in that, in what does it mean for a community to strive toward its own destiny. I think that can tie into the concept of nationalism, I suppose, that, or even just to have a recognition of a community sharing a common sense of authenticity. Like, community shares an inauthenticity in the sense of the existence of the they, right? We can all be inauthentic together in the sense that we all lose ourselves in what everybody else says. Nobody's actually accountable for any of the ideas of the they. The accountability disperses into nowhere. No one has decreed it to be so. It just happens when we all submit to the they. But there's a collective authenticity which is striving toward our destiny. And I found that interesting. And I think that's something that I want to explore a bit more of, and I hope that some of Heidegger's other works will go into more detail about that, because in this book it's really touched on extremely briefly. And that, I guess, is going to wrap up my investigation of this book. Like I said, it's something that I wanted to present sort of for a foundation for future podcasts and future explorations of Heidegger. I've got books by Heidegger, I've got books about Heidegger, and I want to explore Heideggerian existentialism. And I want to, I know there's a book by Alexander Dugin about Heidegger, and it's kind of one of the core books that takes a sort of a right-wing Heideggerian philosophical approach. So I'm really looking forward to cracking that one open and seeing how we can incorporate some of these ideas into a conservative or right-wing perspective. If you like the podcast and you think that this is a valid and important area of exploration, like I do, I encourage you to leave a review for the podcast, and I encourage you to visit my Patreon page and help me out. Help me get some of the books that I've got on my wish list that I want to get to reviewing. I want to get some more recent stuff so that we can stay on top of some of the current ideas. I've got bookshelves of books that need to get reviewed, but a lot of them are not quite as current. And so there's a few books out there right now that are much more current that I'm gonna need to get, and I can use all the help I can get. I said this before, but I'll throw it out there again just because I work a full-time job in a factory. I work overtime most every week so that I can pay my bills and get the books I want and keep my head above water. But I can't do podcasts all day every day because I have to work. But if I could make this into my career, and I could probably crank out a podcast every single week. If I were to devote myself to this wholeheartedly, and if I were to, really get a solid, maybe media website up where I can have other people, myself and other people, maybe writing articles that could help to define and expand the concept of neo-fusionism, because I believe in it. And I want to do what I can to get it moving. And this podcast is great. It might only be the first step, but that would depend on me being able to do this full time. And that would depend on me being able to bring in some money to pay my bills so that I don't have to devote myself completely to the grind. So there's my plea. If you want to go to Patreon, throw me down a couple bucks a month to, show your support for what I'm doing and for an exploration of some of the potential avenues that right-wing thought can go down, I wholeheartedly appreciate it. So if you have set up an account with Patreon, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. And if you're considering doing it, go for it. Do it. For less than the price of a cup of coffee per month. Anyway, that's my spiel. Oh, and one last thing. I guess I should mention, I should have said this at the beginning of the show, but the version of Being and Time that I have been working with is the translation by John Macquarie and Edward Robinson. For years, this was considered the only English translation. And another one came up. I believe this one came up. Oh, I wish I knew when exactly this translation. It was in. It doesn't matter. It's the more recent translation by Joan Stambaugh. And it was recommended as the easier translation for noobs, for people who are not Heideggerian scholars. And so I picked it up. But truthfully, I found the original a little easier. I found the first translation a little bit more conversational. The later translation just didn't flow quite as well. So I wanted to, let you guys know which translation I was operating on. At some point in time, I might go ahead and read the other translation. It's sitting on my shelf. I might go in and read it and see if I can reinforce and refine my understanding of this book. But I've got so many books to read right now. I've got so many podcasts that I want to do that's not high on my list. But anyway, so I wanted you to know which translation I was using. Anyway, coming up next, our next podcast is going to be In Defense of Tradition by Richard Weaver. So come around next time and check us out. That'll do it for now. Bye.